Let's begin with toxicology. So a toxin is something that taken in a sufficient amount of quantity will overwhelm homeostasis of the body. Anything taken in overabundance can overwhelm the body systems, even to take for granted water. And we'll talk about that perhaps in the classroom setting. Now, when we need help as far as developing a poison or toxin, we'd like to address Poison Control Center. The number for that is 1-800-222-1222, 1-800-222-1222. Okay, toxin now needs to somehow introduce itself into the body to cause that a negative response, that it's toxic response. So we have a few routes. These routes will vary in as far as the ability for it to be absorbed into the bloodstream, and then for it to then translate or work in its toxic nature. So we have some of the least that would be least absorptive route would be through the skin or dermal layer, through just natural absorption. It takes a little longer as it has to go through the layers of the dermis, then enter into the bloodstream. Now, that's different from somewhere like sublingual. Now, sublingual there, we have quite a large blood supply there, and we kind of allude blood supply and sublingual in that area closer to the GI tract or ingestion, where it has to go into the stomach and then be broken down. However, again, sublingual is very similar to maybe respiratory or injected, so inhalation or injection, where once it enters into the bloodstream, it can rapidly disseminate itself and then act upon whatever receptor sites or organs that it would target for its negative effects. So we can kind of consider some prevention strategies as far as absorption, ingestion, inhalation, and we can kind of anticipate what we would use, at least barriers, plain barriers or respiratory barriers, gloves, and then make sure that there's no chance of penetrating through the dermal layer or skin, and then washing your hands immediately after having some kind of exposure. So that brings us to scene size up. It goes without saying that we should always keep scene safety front and foremost, and never forget until actually we not only just leave the scene, because we're taking part of the scene with us, and that would be the patient. And we want to make sure that that patient gets to the hospital, and that person could create a new scene. And that means whether or not they're behavioral emergency or they're transporting some of that contaminant with them, if they're biological, chemical, or radiological. And in this case, we're talking about toxicology, which kind of all blends together. The scene, we're moving the scene closer. So if we are bringing them contaminated, if they are still incapacitated or somehow under control or influence of the toxic substance, keep that in mind. And then we need to isolate and figure out what route, and figure out if the absorption is going to be more rapid versus more delayed, and how we can combat that and protect everyone else. As far as our reference material that goes, we have the MSDS, and those are safety data sheets, or SDS. And then we have the emergency response guide. This is an orange book that usually gives us an idea of the different types of toxic substances and what we can do with it. It's color coded, and we use this to start our response, and then use this in the management in the event that we are using this through the entire response. As far as the assessment goes, each toxic substance has potentially a specific sign and symptom that we need to be aware of. And then we'll go over this as we get into the specific substance that we're talking about. For example, like Tylenol, aspirin, or NSAIDs, which are some of the more common medications or over-the-counter OTCs that people will use to do their non-lethal, but it could eventually lead to some prolonged disability, overdoses, or suicidal ideations. So we'll go over those a little later, but just keep in mind that as far as patient assessments, we are looking at probably finding a particular type of signs and symptoms that go along with the toxin. What we need to know about our history and assessment, though, we need to know what was taken. Again, what was taken, the time that this was taken, the time again, the route of this administration, the route with which this medication or toxin was absorbed or introduced into the body, and if there was anything else, again, anything else that they took or potentially used to relieve it or alleviate some of the symptoms. And this is just some of the simple, basic questions that we want so we can understand how much of the toxin that's ended up into either the bloodstream or digestive tract or respiratory tract or on the skin, so that we can understand its disbursement throughout the body systems. So beginning to toxidromes, and as we start off, I'd like to start off with some of the simpler ones, aspirin, Tylenol, and NSAIDs. We'll end up going into some of more buzzword or the anecdotal Hollywood scheme things where the medics are always like pimping you or trying to make sure that do you know this. So we'll talk about toxicology and toxidromes in the next module.